Hey guys, it's Merrick here. I'm going to be doing my very first tutorial for you guys. It's a little producer's tip. Today I'm going to be talking about compressors, what they are and how to use them. So without further ado, let's get into this track I've started. It's very simple and very basic, just designed to show you how compressors work. So hopefully you guys can hear me. It's my very first video doing this tutorial, so let's just get into it. Let me show you the whole track roughly real quick. So that's just a quick drum pattern and a bass line that has bass frequencies as well as higher res frequencies, you could say. So let me just solo out the bass so you could hear what that sounds like. So there's a few things you could do with the compressor. Basically what a compressor does, it takes signal and compresses the signal. You could think of it as if you have a fader, a volume fader, and as something gets too loud, you lower the volume. And the compressor will do this automatically. Every time it hits a certain volume, it'll lower that peak every time and go back to the baseline where you have it set to. So that threshold, the threshold is where it'll kick in. So if there's a peak and the signal goes louder than that threshold, wherever you set it, it'll lower that those frequencies that go past that threshold. So basically, if you think of it as a tube, dynamic range of signals between very low volume or the noise level, 0 decibel you could say, to the highest volume. Wherever you set that threshold, it'll try to compress the signal. So basically what you're doing is you're losing dynamic range. If you really understand it, it's a physics problem. You're squeezing this into a lower space. A lot of new producers think compressors will just make the sound louder, and that's a huge mistake actually, because yes, you could use compressors to make any signal a lot louder, crazy loud, but what you're doing is you're effectively losing so much dynamic space. So what they're doing is they're compressing the signal, squeezing all these frequencies, or I should say actually all these all this volume, squeezing that down, and then they're boosting that whole squished signal up more to make the whole thing louder. So yeah, you could do that easily. A lot of people do that, but that's not really what a compressor is all about. They're losing dynamic space and they're pushing the signal, which you could use that. It's like a saturator kind of thing. Saturators work a little differently, but let's just get into the compressor. So right here, let me put that back on. It's soloed. So right now the compressor's on, but it's not doing anything. It's actually not on. The compressor's off, but you could see signal coming through in the output. So right here on the output, same signal coming in is coming out. Let me delete this. This is probably distracting some of you guys. Oh, by the way, I'm using the normal default Ableton Live compressors that it came with. Actually, I'll just delete this one, load up a brand new compressor. So for those who are following, we'll see this view at the very beginning. If you have Ableton 9, maybe even Ableton 8, but this is definitely probably 9 or newer. So this is what you see. Basically, it's on right now. The threshold is all the way up to the max level, so it's not going to do anything. I play it, whatever's coming in, the threshold, whatever's coming in is going out. So you could see it coming in, going out. Nothing is in the middle. The middle is GR, that's gain reduction. So that's what it's going to be doing. It's going to take the peaks and reduce it in volume, all the peaks. So it's going to be blending in those peaks with the rest of the signal. Right now the threshold's too high, nothing's going to be squished. Nothing's really happening yet. But we could lower the threshold and you will see some gain reduction. So I'll go ahead and do that, and I'll lower it extreme so you could kind of have a better sense of what's going on for those who can't hear, or like they're not tuned yet to hear slight differences. So what you hear is a whole bunch of frequencies getting smashed. Nothing is actually, I'll explain this in a second. So you could look at the gain reduction and you see a lot of signal is being smashed. Now one thing that's on right now is this makeup. Is it markup? Makeup. It's makeup. But it could be called markup, it could be volume markup, gain markup, or any of those terms if you use a different compressor, and by all means use a different compressor. If you're on a different platform, you're not on Ableton. So what that is doing is it's actually keeping the average volume at a set level where the signal coming in, it's looking at that volume and it's going to output that same volume. So if you take this off, if you encounter other compressors where there's no markup, this is just, the markup is, I guess, a cheap tool that Ableton threw in so you don't have to worry about it. I would always disable. The first thing I do is take it off, so I have control over the final volume, because we're going to be processing the signal and technically it's going to be a different signal coming out of it. That markup is just bringing it back to that level you had when you came up. So let me disable that, put the threshold back to 0 so nothing's going on right now. And then I'm going to lower the threshold and you could hear a drop in total volume as well as dynamic space. You see that got really low. So once you do that, once you're compressing the signal down really low, then you could boost the output back to the level that you need, and you could hear that basically the signal is compressed and you're having all the frequencies more or less on the same decibel range. So there's a lot less dynamic space than if I were to drop the threshold, get the gain reduction back to 0, the output back to 0. There should be no gain reduction. There's more of the lower, so you go from the low volume, the least amount of volume, to the highest amount of volume. There's a lot more of that space going on if you hear it. And if we go extreme, it's like that small. Even if you go, so if you press markup, put that to 0, there's a big difference. It really is. So there's another cool view that Ableton gives you. There's 3 views that they give you. We just started on the default view, which is really all you need. If you have a compressor rack, that's all you're going to see for the most part. There's this other view where you could actually see what the threshold is, and then you could see what it's doing, if it's passing the threshold or not. Basically, you see the gain reduction, but in more of a dynamic way. So right now there's no gain reduction, and you can see the solid yellow is the maximum volume at any given time. So you can see where it goes. So if you have a signal that's too loud or too low, you could see where that solid yellow point is going to be at. Then you could bring your threshold down and a little bit lower if you want to compress the top end of the signal. That's more of a nice warm way. Notice I took away the markup because that's just like artificial. The other view that's really cool, it's actually really good to show you guys, is this view. You could see where the signal is, and then you could see the threshold, and then you could actually see what the compressor is doing in a visual space. So let's play this. So the dark gray is the actual signal, and at the peaks where it's loudest you're going to see this yellow curve dip in volume. So the yellow is the volume. Right now it's all the way straight at the very top because it's at its max volume, but anytime a peak goes past the orange threshold, it'll dip in volume. You can see that. So I'll go extreme. I guess that's not extreme enough. Let's see what we could do. There's another thing you could do with compressors that's really cool. Has a lot of uses, and nearly every electronic music that I've heard use this technique. It's called sidechain compression. So basically you take a signal and you're going to be compressing that signal in volume to you're compressing it against another audio signal. So a good way to think about this is if you have a synthesizer playing straight, the signal, anytime something else is played, it'll reduce its volume. So a good thing is with the kicks, you have a bass line or any other synthesizer and you need more space on the kick or something to make it booming, and like people could dance, they could follow a hard kick. Anytime that kick hits, the audio space moves out of the way for the kick to come through clean. So I have a kick, I have a sidechain kick, so it's easy. Let me delete this, start over, load a new compressor. Everything's by default. This little down arrow will turn to the side. There's a button called sidechain. There's other ways to do this with other compressors, very, very easy. You just tell it where the signal is coming into, the signal that you want it to compress against. So here, audio from, I'm going to go from my kick, and it's going to take that kick, listen to that kick, and every time that kick hits, the harder it hits, the more compression we'll get on this bass line. So markup is already, as you can see, it's already grayed out because you can't have markup when you're sidechaining. You could up the output, which is almost the same as markup, but you can't guess what that level is because you're going to be changing the you're going to be processing the signal. The signal is going to be different when it comes out. So the threshold's at 0, so nothing's happening when that kick is playing. So let me unmute this, and you got to hear it dry without a compression. Actually, I see a little bit of gain reduction, which is weird. It might be going past the threshold. Yeah. Okay. So right now nothing's going on. The bass is the same. The bass line. Let me get rid of this symbol. Okay. Now we're gonna bring the threshold down. So anytime that anytime that kick hits harder, it's gonna compress this bass line more. So it's gonna be more of a pumping thing. Volume's gonna go down when the kick is hitting, and it's gonna come back up, and go down, come back up. I'm gonna lower the attack. So the attack and the release is when this compressor starts and lets go of its process. So the attack is as soon as it goes past the threshold, how fast will it react? And then once it's over that threshold below it, how long until it releases its compression? And the compression is all about ratio. As you can see, the top knob here is a ratio. How much compression are you going to give it? How much are you going to smash it down? The attack is how quick you're going to do it, and the release is how quick you're going to let go of that compression once it goes below that threshold. So let's do a comparison of, I'm going to solo out the bass. It's compressed sidechain to the kick. I can already hear that pumping, which is great for dance music. And then I'm going to disable the compressor, and you could hear the difference. So this is two stagnant and there's no swing to it. Gotta boost the volume a little bit because the compressor lowered everything. It actually lowered the peaks, it didn't touch the bottom, but everything smashed, pushing the bottom. So if you have one frequency that's, if you have the same frequency that's louder and it's above the threshold, and threshold push, and the compressor pushes it down, it's gonna hit that frequency. So you're losing dynamic space and things could clash a little bit, but you don't have to worry so much about the technical stuff. You just have to know that you're smashing the signals downwards. And let's mark up the volume a little bit. With no compressor. Alright, so now we got a pumping bass line. The bass line is not that great. I have to work on it a lot more. There's another thing you could do. So over here on the right, there's 3 options. We've been working on peak, which is what I use almost every day. What it's doing, this compressor on peak, is only taking the peak decibels and compressing those downwards. It's taking anything louder than that threshold, anything that goes above that threshold is going to smash down those peaks. The next one is RMS, that stands for root mean square. So basically it's taking the average of all the decibels. It's the root mean squared, so it's basically taking an average of all the volumes of all the frequencies and squaring them down to get a unbiased average, because if you just square them, it's a mathematical thing. If you take a set of numbers, let's say a bunch of different decibels at different ranges, what you need to do is you square them so they're all positive, because if you have the threshold here and the decibel is lower, you're going to have a negative. How far away are you from this threshold? You could be plus 2 decibels and you're in the positive 2, which is over the threshold, or you could be minus 2 or minus 5. And the thing is, to get them, how far is the negative 5 signal from the plus 2 signal? What it's taking is that threshold. It's taking the negative 5 and needs to turn into a positive 5, because it needs to know how much space, doesn't matter what direction, how much space is it from each from the threshold, how far down, how far up, it doesn't matter where it goes. That's the average volume. Is you square it, so you bring those negative values up to a positive number, and the positive ones are also squared, so they're on the same plane now. When you square anything, even a negative, it becomes positive. There's no such thing as a negative. I shouldn't say there's no such thing. If you square any number, no matter if it's positive or negative, you're going to end up with a positive number. So what it does, that's the root squared, the root mean squared. So the mean is the average. It could go above the average, it could go below the average. Average is like an average. And squared, so it's all positive, and that'll give you the good average volume. It's kind of technical. If you study physics, you'll understand root mean squared. It's one of the ways you could understand how loud something is. There's a whole debate on loudness. They call it the loudness war, and one of them is root mean squared. The other one is peak, how loud that loudest frequency goes. But our ears, sometimes we don't know how loud something is unless other frequencies are just as loud. So that peak doesn't really apply in our ears all the time. Computers could pick up the loudest frequency easily. But I believe for humans, it takes three samples or 5 samples at the same loudness, at the same decibel, I should say, for us to understand how loud that is. We could have I'll make another video on the loudness war, because that'll be actually really fun. So that's the second option, root mean squared. The third option is expand, which is a totally different way traditional compressors work. I never actually used expand because I don't really have a lot of use for it. I've actually used dynamic expanders, which works like a reverse compressor. So expand, instead of crushing the the signal, it actually takes that signal and expands anything above the threshold. So the threshold is going to be somewhere in that signal range, and it's going to expand upwards. So if you need something, if you need a mid-frequency louder, you could use this expand compression, where it'll take that signal and it'll boost it up. You can't make up dynamic range. So if you lose dynamic range in that sample, it's just going to stay that way. You could expand it to make space in between frequencies, like a notch filter, which is great because sometimes you need the space. But that sample, you could only degrade sound or give it some warmth and add distortion to it. Sometimes that could be a good thing. Sometimes actually adding distortion, sometimes a little bit of distortion, depending on how you do it, it'll add dynamic space because it'll add on top of your signal sometimes. But yeah, so let's I think that's it for this video on compression. Sidechain compression is something I use a lot in dance music, EDM. You want that kick to come through like nice and hard. You want it to be centered. You don't want to create two kicks clashing in the same frequencies, phasing them out. You want it to be mono, straightforward. If you're in a club and the DJ is pushing music, you want that kick to go straight through the room, through their bodies. You don't want a left and right panning, the same kick panned hard left, hard right. If you go to a club and one speaker is off to the side more, not centered, that kick is going to be out of phase with the other subwoofer, and it could cancel each other out. Basically what happens is you don't have a hard enough kick, and it's hard to follow that rhythm. You really want to feel that kick when you're at the dance floor. So sidechain compression works really well with lower bass frequencies, getting that stuff out of the way so the kick could come through, and then filling it back up when the kick is gone until it comes back. That rhythm, it's pumping. Also, so this is just a basic compressor. Obviously we went through the peak, the root mean square, and the expand options, but there's also something called a multi-band compressor, which is used a lot in mastering, but it could also be used in normal effects chains. It's basically a compressor, but many compressors. It could be 3 or 2 or more. Basically what it does is you compress certain bands. So a multi-band compressor, you could compress just the top frequencies or the mid frequencies or both, but sometimes you want to leave the bass frequencies alone so they're not crushed, and it has a nice sine wave, so it completes a good bass line without getting distorted. But the top high frequencies, you could have some grit to it. So yeah, multi-band compressors are pretty useful, very useful. I can't get away from them. So I'll do another tutorial a little bit later with the multi-band compressors.